Hey. So, the first real question that I have is who was Laura Perls for you in your experience?
Ah, good question. Uh, for several years, Laura Perls, who at that point I had never met, was the woman I was supposed to move back to New York and fight with and be in competition with. Uh, I came back to LA. I did my internship here at UCLA Neuropsychiatric, then went back east for a year to finish my dissertation. And I came back for 1 year to study with Jim Simkin and Fritz. So I came back for 1 year, and I've been here over 50 years since then.
Mhm.
Fritz said to me, when you go back to New York, you can start an institute, and you can. And I said, hold it. Uh, if I go back to New York, I'm going to meet with Laura, if she will meet with me, and talk with her and see if we can do something together, or, et cetera. And he said, no, 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 no. We start a different institute. And I said to him, Fritz, you fight with your own wife. I'm not getting in the middle of that. So that's how it started with her. Then I met her in New York, and we had a long-term, not terribly close, but a long-time relationship. Uh, we invited her out here in the early 70s several times first to work with our faculty, and then later on some open workshops. And every time I went to New York, which was fairly regularly as a New Yorker, and I have a lot of family back there, and we even like each other. So went back frequently, and every time I would have lunch or brunch or coffee with Laura. So I got to know her. We had some interesting theoretical conversations. One that stands out is the word do, D-U-E.
Mhm.
Talk about what's due the situation. And she pointed out, which is of course obvious when somebody else says it, that the word duty is a rigidification and a frozenness of what's due the situation. Essentially, she's talking about character at the social level of organization rather than the individual organization. That what's due in the situation, if it gets fixed, becomes known as duty. Uh, so you do it regardless of the situation. You have a duty to love your parents. At one point, you may love your parents, but if it becomes fixed in a fixed way, then it's duty. And I like that very much.
Mhm.
Um, we would always, when we invited her out here to do workshops and training, we would spend a lot of time with her socially. She was, I don't know if you know, she trained as a pianist, and at one time was thinking of a whether to go psychology or go concert piano, and she went psychology. But she was an excellent pianist, and when she would do a workshop, if there was a piano there, she would spend the breaks playing the piano. Uh, I think because she enjoyed it. Well, I know she enjoyed it, but I also have a speculation / interpretation that she was hiding that way. She was
Mhm.
a bit shy without some structure in a workshop, or being the therapist or the trainer who gave her the structure. So she would play the piano, and she was a very good pianist. Excellent, classical, of course.
Mhm.
So that's how I knew her. Somebody I visited every time I went to New York, not almost every time, and had interesting discussions with her. Um,
Mhm.
she was kind of an aristocratic woman. She was raised uh, upper middle or upper Jewish class German, with all the culture of the German situation, the culture of music and philosophy and poetry and literature and movement and dance. And she was very much all of those things. And in fact, could sometimes be a bit haughty and snobby, that Americans don't have that. And what I heard later on is that in her later years, when she was doing workshops in Europe, she frequently, or not infrequently, would tell those workshops one of the things she enjoyed about doing training in Europe is that if she made a literary reference or a music reference, they would know what she's talking about, while the Americans didn't. I mean, they're two different cultures, and while it's true, the educational system is quite different, much more practical in the States, and much more liberal arts generic in Germany and Northern Europe, well, all of Europe actually. She made it into a bit of a hierarchy. So that what fit one situation is better than what fit another situation. And I don't think she ever changed on that. On the other hand, she was smart and had a sense of humor. And I would occasionally tease her about that. That, oh, that's when she said she liked something. I said, no, that's too American. And she knew what I was saying, and she would laugh. So we had fun together.
Mm-hmm. And what about her work? The experiences that you might have had watching her, training with her.
Mm-hmm.
How did you experience it, and what has stayed with you?
She had some very solid areas of working. She was really good with working with the body. Excuse me. Mm-hmm. With breathing. She had studied for years with Elsa Gendler, who was a breathing specialist in Europe. And she was very good at reading the body, which was both a blessing and a curse. She was very good at looking at the body, how somebody moved, how somebody walked, and noticing it and relating it and exploring support issues. The lower half of the body she would talk about is mostly for support functions, and the upper half of the body is mostly for contact functions. And the integration of the two is where there were sometimes problems, either not enough support or for the contact, or the contact was off, but it was always based in a support issue. She would say that clinical work could be divided into contact work or support work. It would always start with one of them, more likely contact than support. But it would always go to support, which makes sense. You can't have any better contact than you have the support to have the capacity for contact. You can't demonstrate, manifest what you don't have the capacity for in the first place. So support was very important to her. She was very good. She would sometimes have somebody walk purposefully, but frequently she would just pick it up about how people would walk to get coffee, or how they would move or not move. And that's the blessing of her. The curse of her is that she would make meaning of some of those movements and interpret it, and come up with an interpretation. And it was as if her interpretation was now the default. And if you couldn't disavow her of her interpretation, then of course she was right. So there was a bit of rigidity in her righteousness of her interpretation that could be sometimes difficult. She had very, very good eyes. Her ears were not so good, because her ears were more affected by what she saw and the meaning she made out of it. So what somebody else said, what the person said, was not given equal validity to what she saw. So she was a mixture. She did a workshop for us at a colleague's house in Topanga Canyon, and there was some guy who had been in Gestalt training for a little while, so he had all the language down right. And she said, "And what do you want?" And he said, "I'm fine. I don't want anything. I just want to listen and I want to observe." And she said, "Yeah, but what do you really want?" And he said, "I'm fine. I'm here. I'm listening. I want to be responsive to what goes on. There's nothing that I want at this moment, and I'm clear about that." She went after him 3 or 4 times. At the end of the 2-day workshop, they're doing closing and saying goodbye. And she said, "Before I say goodbye," and she turns her head to this guy and she says, "So you thought we'd forget about you?" And he went through his routine again, and she kept pulling. And either that time she was right, or the guy just came up with something as hush money to shut her up, because something did come out. So there was something valuable and useful, but it was it's difficult because it made some of the people feel a little less safe, that if they take a clear statement, that it won't be honored if she thinks differently. But it was quite funny. We would tease her, and for years, "Oh, so you thought we'd forget about you?" So she was kind of a show horse and a bulldog.
I was going to ask about the differences between her leadership style or her way of holding that powerful position and how it was different from Fritz. Because I've heard him described as the showman, but now what you're talking about is a little different.
Yeah, he was a showman because, well, he wasn't. He was a showman, especially when he was being filmed, which is why I think Gloria went so poorly. It's my speculation that he was pressured to make something happen, because what he noticed about Gloria in the film was pretty right on, but how he dealt with it and how he tried to push her was not really respecting who she was. And rather than telling her the impact on him, how she landed on him, he would tell her how she was, and try and move her, etc. But when he wasn't being filmed, he wasn't pushing to make something happen so much. He was quieter. He was more wanting the client to come to him. He would use almost essentially the hot seat, where you sit either next to him or near him. And you would have to make that commitment verbally and behaviorally. Get up and move, etc. Now, I don't know if he wanted to know that the person was in for the engagement, or whether it's something more egotistical about, "I don't want something, I want you to want something." He didn't go after people the way Laura did. He would sometimes go after people in more circumspect ways, with a little jab or something like that. He was much more provocative. He was I've called him many times he liked dialectics, and he was mischievous in his exaggeration. So he would say iconoclastic things to shake the world up and shake people up. The intellect is the whore of intelligence. Lose your mind and come to your senses. And the Gestalt prayer.
All of these things which have become T-shirts, right?
Yes, and they're all provocative. They're the dialectic to what he saw as what was out of balance. I mean, he never meant, for example, the intellect was bad. He meant it was out of balance, that in the 60s and 50s, people were in their heads very much and not in their bodies and not in their emotions. So he's talking about rebalancing, but he doesn't talk about it that way. He comes with some extreme statement of lose your mind and come to your senses. Laura
What
was,
about Laura?
yeah, she didn't do that kind of stuff. She was much more straightforwardly intellectual, academic. She would share her beliefs. She would share information, data. She wasn't provocative the way he was. Provocative a little bit in when she was a bulldog with her interpretations. Fritz was perfectly willing to let go of interpretations. He was perfectly willing to be wrong. And he owned that the interpretation resided in him. Laura didn't quite own that. She acted as if the interpretation resided in the client, that she was describing something over there rather than a schema of meaning that she manufactured in her head, where the locus is over here rather than over there. They were quite different in the way they worked. I mean, she would start with support issues and he would start with provoking.
And what about your contact with Laura or your work with Laura has really stayed with you personally, either in your own life or in your work?
Well, one of the things was to give up a speculation if the client has a different experience, speculation about them on the one hand, but on the other hand, don't throw it away completely, because sometimes there's some usefulness and sometimes some accuracy that can be useful. So while not holding it in a pushy way anymore, not throwing it away so you're against that idea now. The idea of support in a way is privileged in therapy, that the issues usually start about contact, but they always get to support. Even they may sometimes start as support issues, but they always end up as support issues. That has been important and a useful, albeit a bit binary, but a useful lens to have among other lenses. Also her softness and her, she was not a pushover, but she could be soft and could be sweet. But she and Fritz, when they hit their boundary, that was it. I mean, Fritz would get a little crazy about that if it was a demonstration and it was especially being filmed or a lot of people around. If the person didn't do something, he would get a little paranoid and, oh, you're trying to make a fool of me, which occasionally was true. There were people who would go up and, you know, oh, you think you're the best gunslinger in the West? I'll show you. That happened occasionally. But frequently, the person was dancing as fast as they could, that they had a functional disability. They weren't functionally able to do what he was asking them to do. And he would sometimes not focus on what the difficulty is, what's the interruption to either saying no or doing it. He would instead make an interpretation that the person isn't doing it, that they were trying to thwart him or make a fool of him. Laura didn't do that. She would not take it personally. She would see it more as the person, if they didn't follow what she wanted, was resisting. And she didn't particularly see, or at least I never heard her talk about resistance as a inappropriate thing. It's the best the person can do at the moment. It's not a bad thing to get rid of to get to the therapy. That is the therapy. The alleged resistance, the alleged defense mechanisms, the alleged boundary interruptions, those are not things to get rid of in order to get to the therapeutic issue. Those are the therapeutic issues. And they're right there happening in the room.
Would you
That's the
say that
thing.
she fundamentally respected that a little bit more, whereas it sounds like Fritz would try and plow through them a little bit more?
Um, I don't know. I don't think I've seen her work enough to
Hmm.
be able to have an informed opinion about that. But she didn't take it, like I saw enough to know that she didn't take it personally that they were trying to show her up.
Hmm.
And Fritz would too frequently go to that.
Hmm.
And unfortunately, since it was true once in a while, he was kind of confirmed enough that he
Yeah.
could hold on to that.
Yeah. So, do you think that Laura had a sense of the depth and the transcendence of the work that they were doing?
Absolutely. I think in some ways, as much or more than Fritz, uh,
Hmm.
because I think she was very much in touch with the integration that they brought was not an integration of just psychotherapies like psychoanalysis and
Hmm.
behaviorism, which were the two at the time, but bringing in all kinds of things and integrating from outside of psychotherapy, like movement and breathing and dance, like linguistics and anthropology and biology and sociology and politics, and field theory and Gestalt theory. Laura is who brought Gestalt perceptual psychology, Gestalt psychology. She brought that to the table. Fritz
Hmm.
didn't know anything about that. She was studying with Gestalt psychologists for her doctorate in Frankfurt am Main University there. Uh, she also brought Buber, and she brought Paul Tillich, both of whom were teaching at Frankfurt when she was there. And she would make an off-the-cuff remark that she was a kid. She had a course with Buber, but it went right over her head. She said, "I was a kid. I had no idea what he was talking about until decades later, or years later, not decades."
Hmm.
But she brought Gestalt psychology to the table, and she brought movement and body to the table. And Fritz poo-pooed that at first, the body
Hmm.
stuff. Uh, and she brought the existential Paul Tillich, who was a Protestant theologian, and Martin Buber, who was a Jewish theologian, and both of them were philosophers as well. So I think she had a probably even more of a sense than Fritz of the depth and gravity of
Hmm.
what they were doing. She also brought the whole thing of uh, oral aggression. Um, Presumably, I don't know if this is true, but the apocryphal story is that she essentially wrote the chapter in Ego, Hunger, and Aggression on oral aggression, and supposedly coming mostly from experience of nursing her babies.
Hmm.
Uh, so yeah, I think she was more interested in that uh, intellectual amalgam and integration than Perls was, or that he showed.
And just this is a complete speculation, but what do you think she would say or feel or think about where Gestalt is in the world now?
Um, I think she would have a mixed reaction, of course.
Hmm.
Uh, she was very much, and I really support this, very much and agree with her, against Gestalt and, as she called it, Gestalt and bodywork,
Hmm.
Gestalt and spirituality, Gestalt and relationship, Gestalt and. If you hold a model of Gestalt therapy as she did, and the model as I do, then you can integrate many, many, many things from other areas into a Gestalt model. It's not an add-on. It's not a tack-on if it can be integrated. There are some things that cannot be integrated into the fundamental structure and foundational supports of Gestalt therapy, but there are some things that cannot. They may be useful, but they're not Gestalt therapy.
Hmm.
If it can be, then it becomes part of it. So when somebody says, I do Gestalt therapy and body work, Laura would look down her nose. That you don't do Gestalt therapy and body work. You know, it's not one from the main dish and one from dessert. It's an integration if you have a fundamental appreciation of the model in the first place. So she was very, very much against the tacking on of, of other things. Like, you could use a technique from another modality if you could integrate it, but then it's not a tack on. Now it can be part of, because we're a process therapy, we're not a content therapy. So if it fits with the process approach, it would be fine. If it's a tag on, it might not be fine. That I think is a really important contribution that I appreciate of hers.
And that cultured part, where do you think that fits in the academic or the non-academic stance? Is it just experiential, or should it be formal and academic and developed?
She was against bureaucracy, but she was for an academic background, knowing what you're talking about, not just starting at the last scene and doing what somebody else told you to do, but noticing. I mean, they both, Fritz and Laura, both came with backgrounds from psychoanalysts from the tradition of Wilhelm Reich and Karen Horney and Otto Fenichel and a whole bunch of it, Kurt Goldstein for the holism, and then from Buber, I mean, from many, many, many people. And then they would create this integration that then had some techniques, but the techniques were the least important. If you start the other way around and you just do the techniques, but you don't have a clue of where they came from, then you really don't understand what's going on. And you don't have the opportunity to creatively come up with a different technique, a new way of doing something that facilitates awareness. Because they came from this rich background. They didn't just learn 12 techniques and wait for the client to do something that they can plug one of those techniques into. At the personal level, it would make her a bit aloof. The idea of the valuing so highly the, if you will, provincial, I know this is a strange use of the word here, the provincial European view of education, which is a broad and deep in philosophy and in literature and poetry and all of the arts, and which is great. But it isn't so great when it's used as any other clustering or organization of education is not as good, without even exploring what's the difference about, what's useful for where you are, for the kind of education you're doing, what's useful for people who live in the culture and in the environment that you live in. How does it fit the situation, which is what Fritz kept coming back to, and what Laura was talking about when she said, "What's due the situation?" In that recent 50 pages of Fritz's new book that he never finished, The Psychopathology of Awareness, he talks about the wisdom is in the situation, what fits the situation. And Laura was saying the same thing with slightly different languaging of what's due the situation. So they agreed on that. They had difficulty, obviously, getting along. But it's not surprising because they were both prima donnas. And it's hard to have two prima donnas. It's a contradiction in terms. You can't have two prima donnas. Yep. Not everybody can come in first. They, on the other hand, they really cared about each other. in some strange ways, Laura was always happy to tell the story that Fritz has been gone for years. He hadn't lived in New York for years, in their apartment on 7 West 96th Street, which, by the way, the New York Institute still uses that address.
Oh.
They haven't been there in decades, but the New York Institute uses that address. I think it's more emotional than anything else, but it's kind of lovely in a way. But Laura would delight in telling the story that out of nowhere, she would get a phone call. And it was Fritz calling from Idlewild Airport. Idlewild Airport is the old name for John F. Kennedy Airport in New York.
Okay.
So he would call her and he would say, "I'm home. I'll be there in 45 minutes." Or "I'll be home in 45 minutes. And she loved that he said he would be home. That there was something about the primacy of that word. With home is not just the apartment at 7 West 96th Street. Home is Laura as well. And she would proudly tell that story. Fritz would do some similar things. He had a 75th birthday celebration at the 1968 APA convention in San Francisco. There were several hundred of us in the Miyako Hotel, and he got a lot of beautiful birthday presents. He spent so long walking around the room showing everybody. Laura didn't come to the birthday party, but she sent him a sweater, and he took out this sweater, and he was going around the room showing everybody the sweater that Laura sent him for his birthday. And they should feel the sweater, and they should look at the sweater. And he was making it clear that I'm important to Laura. Just as she, with her story, "I'm coming home," I'm important to Fritz. So they maintained some kind of a connection, probably the best the two prima donnas could do, which had to be mostly at a distance, because she was looking for more contact and he was looking for more withdrawal. In the end, I don't know if you know this story, Fritz died first and he was cremated. And Laura, presumably, kept the ashes. Somebody said in a shoebox. I doubt if it was in a shoebox, but she kept the ashes in her closet. And when she was getting near the end of her life, she wanted to go back to her hometown, which was Pforzheim, and she in Germany, and she took the ashes with her, Fritz's ashes. And when she died, she left instructions that she be cremated and that the ashes of Fritz and Laura be mixed together and buried in the Jewish cemetery where her family, the Posner family, was buried. Rita and I visited that cemetery, and we found the Jewish section and we found some Posners, but we couldn't find where Fritz and Laura's, their mixed ashes were buried. But in the end, she won. That they were mixed together. They were essentially confluent for eternity. And in her family's plots, and he didn't get along very well with her family, and they didn't get along very well with him. He would be provocative with them, and they didn't like him. He wasn't of the right class, even though he was a physician. His father was a wine merchant, and they were much more cultured than that. Have you heard about the soup?
I haven't heard about the soup. It
Well,
doesn't have anything to do with the ashes, but
no, it doesn't. But Fritz would delight in pissing her family off. So when he was invited there for dinner, if they served soup, he would pick up the bowl and slurp it, just to stick it to them. and to confirm that he was the oaf that they thought he was. And a personal funny story, I was driving him to UCLA one time to do a lecture, and he wanted to stop at a Jewish deli. He wanted chicken soup. So we stopped, and we didn't have much time, so we were sitting at the counter, and he's picking up the bowl of soup and starting to slurp. And I started to laugh. And I said to him, Fritz, Laura's parents are long dead. They're nowhere near around here. He says, I know, but I still like to do it and bug people.
Wow. So I guess the final thing would be, do you have any other memories of Laura that are coming up as you're going through these stories? Any other moment that comes to mind?
Yes, it's kind of a lighthearted but funny moment. I invited her to brunch, and I went and I picked her up at her apartment, 7 West 96th Street, and it's right next to Central Park. And there's a beautiful outdoor restaurant, well, outdoor parts to it, in Central Park. It's called Tavern on the Green, and it's an iconic restaurant. We're sitting outside. It was spring, I think, and there was a young Puerto Rican waiter, and Laura ordered a German pancake, and this young Puerto Rican waiter brought her what they call a German pancake, and she had a shit fit. This is what you call a German pancake? She says, listen to me, young man. And she started to give him a litany of how you're supposed to make a German pancake in Apfelpfannkuchen and how it's supposed to look. And this is nothing like that. And he is looking at me like, who is this lady? Is she nuts? And he had absolutely no interest in learning how to make an apple pancake, German apple pancake. And she just would have none of it. She was just outraged that he would bring that to her. It was about the pancake, and it was about to her. And I couldn't stop laughing. I think she got a little irritated that I laughed so much. She said it was okay later on, but I think she didn't like it very much. But I loved it. They were both characters. They were both lovable, and they were both pain in the ass frequently. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm imagining the scene of you sort of dealing with the divorced parents, you know, it's like, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Mhm. Okay. Well, thank you. Is there
You are
anything
very
else?
welcome, and thank you for doing this, and thank you for doing the Humans of Gestalt project. I think it's a really important and useful thing that you're doing.